Good morning. Welcome to the AKFCF History Workshop. And as we all know, the AKFCF has a rich history. This will be a critical key to our future. It's important to realize those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Preserving our history is the key to our future success. The AKFCF Executive Committee commissioned this workshop to do just that, to help those of you who are new or second or third generation franchisees understand and appreciate how the events of the past relate to today.
When you progress to become our future franchisee leaders and interact with our franchisor, you can be aware of that history and build on the AKFCF's past accomplishments. Now I'd like to introduce the General Counsel for the AKFCF, partner at Briggs & Morgan in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Mr. Andy Sheldon.
The format we're going to follow is that each of our speakers is going to give a brief narration of an important segment of the history of the association. At the end of the presentations, about an hour and a half from now, we will absolutely open up the entire panel to your questions and discussions. If there's anything that has stimulated questions or if there's something that we've overlooked, it'll give you an opportunity to get your questions answered by people who were there, people who did the history. We're going to begin with Bobby Helms, a longtime officer of the Southeast Regional Association, to describe the origins of this association and the formation of the Southeast Association. Bobby?
Thank you. Let me briefly go through a series of events that led to the formation of the AKFCF. The genesis of the AKFCF began in 1972 with the settlement of a lawsuit called a G&K. A part of that settlement was that Kentucky Fried Chicken was to form an advisory council, which they did. It was called the NFAC. Members were appointed from around the country, and as they began to have their meetings, franchisees from all over approached Bob Metzendorf, representative from the Southeast region, which at that time was the only franchisee association in existence, and tried to persuade him to influence the Southeast franchisees to expand into a national organization. Mr. Metzendorf brought that message back to the Southeast Board of Directors. The Board of Directors said to him to take back to his NFAC members the message that there was much value in meeting in smaller groups, sharing experiences, sharing ideas with one another, and some of the most productive information was shared over a drink. Mr. Metzendorf carried that message back. In April of 1974, franchisees from across the country gathered in Atlanta, Georgia on the Sunday preceding the Southeast meeting to once again try to persuade Southeast into expanding into a national organization. That meeting was chaired by Charlie Wentz, then president of Southeast and also president of Scottish Food Systems. The message was the same. Southeast believes there's great value in meetings of smaller numbers. Now, if any of you folks around the country want to form an association, regional association, we will assist you. Out of that meeting was formed a steering committee to explore development of a national organization. That steering committee met in Little Rock, Arkansas in May of 1974, and Don Hines from Hartford, Connecticut, was elected the chairperson and spokesman for that group. In the fall of '74, the Southwest, Upper Midwest, Great Lakes, and Northeast requested of the Southeast assistance in forming their regions. The Southeast Board dispatched myself as president of the Southeast to hold organizational meetings with those regional franchisees. I was assisted at times by Bob and Cookie Metzendorf. Don Hines traveled along with us and presented his vision for a national organization to the franchisees in the organizational meetings. The vision at that time was for a one franchisee, one member. That was not gathering much enthusiasm. But there was enthusiasm for a national clearinghouse of information with other regions being formed and a way to share information and communicate with one another. Therefore, the current plan that it still exists is a chapter organization with each region being a member of a national association, the AKFCF. And that organization got off the ground 30 years ago. And in recognition of his efforts, Don Hines was elected the first president of AKFCF. The matter of rotation of officers on the AKFCF follows the plan of each region. And for 30 years, AKFC has been a pillar of foundation to represent franchisees and communicate with one another all across the country and now all across the world. I might add that even in the organization, the bylaws and as was drafted left us open for international participation. We have had 30 years of training leaders, and that's what your regional associations and AKFC does. It was also setting milestones at that time. In fact, it was in the South, we call it plowing new ground. No one in the food business dreamed of such an organization. No chain had any such organization. And Kentucky Fried Chicken was the first and has been the leader in franchisee recognition by their franchisor and a focus point for franchisees to express their views. So we've got 30 years behind us, and don't ever forget the importance of it. And those of you sitting out there who have not offered yourself for service, I would urge you to step up to the plate and give of yourself to your fellow franchisees. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby. I'm awed. I've been involved with this organization for 18 years, and Bobby and the other speakers this morning, they're not telling you stuff they heard from other people. They were the people who created this history. It's awesome. Our next presenter is Jim Olson from the Harmon Organization. Jim is going to relate to you the history of franchisee innovations that have contributed to the KFC brand and system. Jim?
Franchisees have developed the most successful ideas for our system since the beginning of time. For those of you out there that are new franchisees, you have to understand that it was a much different environment in the early days than what you feel today. Back then, it was a decentralized system. The parent company was weak, and the franchisees had near total freedom to develop their ideas. The Colonel sold the rights to sell his chicken to established restaurateurs and entrepreneurs who used their ingenuity to grow sales. More importantly, they had the need to drive sales because they couldn't count on the parent company to do it for them. Back then, franchisees shared their ideas with one another. Early examples of this is the creation of the bucket. The founder of our company, Pete Harmon, just like all the other early franchisees, sold KFC as an entree on their full-service restaurant menus. Pete believed that if you put 14 pieces of chicken, 5 rolls, and a pint of gravy into an easy carry container, people could take it home. All of a sudden, customers had Sunday dinner 7 days a week. 50 years later, we now call it home meal replacement. The name of Kentucky Fried Chicken even started from a franchisee. In this case again, Pete Harmon, instead of naming it after himself, he picked a name that would describe home cooking and Southern hospitality. I really doubt that Pete's Fried Chicken or Utah Fried Chicken would have had the same effect and captured the imagination of our customers for all these years. But even today, the spirit of innovation and sharing lives. The best idea of the 1990s came from franchisees. John Marcella, here to my left, was the father of Colonel's Rotisserie Gold. This was an excellent product that was maybe just a little ahead of its time and was sabotaged by a pork cooking platform. I wish we had a chance to do it all over again the right way. Billy Ball's buffets. That concept took the country by storm and solved the variety and the value issue for many restaurants. Ben Edwards Crispy Strips was the first product in a long time to break the definition of being just an LTO and becoming a permanent menu item that was a platform for other product innovation. Al Lewin attempted merging a KFC with a Taco Bell, and the multi-branding phenomena was started. Al understood the advantages of leveraging assets and attracting a new customer demographic. Let's face it, our KFC concept is struggling right now. They need our help again. Right now is the time to learn from our past. Our predecessors didn't wait for ideas to happen, they made them happen. Now, I'm not saying that we should buck the system or resist the KFC marketing strategy whatsoever. What I am saying is that we should be the generators of new ideas. There's 700 of us. We each have a huge investment in this brand. We have a process called SET that allows us to be our own research and development department. I challenge each of you. What could be your legacy to the KFC history?
Thank you, Jim. Bobby Helms mentioned the unique relationship that evolved between KFC franchisees and their franchisor. One of the people who was the main driver of the modern evolution of that relationship is John Neal from Columbia, Tennessee. John's the vice chairman of the NCAC, and he's going to give us a description of how the unique franchisor-franchisee relationship in the KFC system came about. John?
Kentucky Fried Chicken was founded, as we know, by the greatest living food legend of all times at the time. Colonel Harlan Sanders had cracked the code on taste, speed of service in a little restaurant located in Corbin, Kentucky. That restaurant exists today as a operating outlet doing approximately $1,700,000 a year. It is a museum. And it is today the only original QSR building still in existence. JRN does operate that restaurant. Now, at an age when most people are thinking of retirement, the Colonel decided to stop frying chicken because he had to auction off his Corbin store as I-75 had bypassed his restaurant. He took his $105 Social Security check, his seasoning, threw it in the back of an old black Cadillac, and went out to franchise. Colonel Sanders even financed some of the early franchisees himself. Royalty was a nickel a head, paid on the honor system by a handshake. He ran the operation from Shelbyville, Kentucky, where the Colonel sold his seasoning, advertising materials to restaurants that featured Kentucky Fried Chicken. In our Corbin Museum, you can even find the big containers of seasoning that he shipped out to franchisees that was mixed at the Shelbyville office. In 1963, the Colonel sold his business to Jack Massey, who happened to be my best friend's father, and John Y. Brown, an enterprising lawyer from Lexington who had the Colonel and a $2 million contract. The price, $2 million, the down payment, $500,000, the balance, 3% over 8 years, $1.5 million. The deal killer was $40,000 a year for the rest of the Colonel's life, who was then 75 years of age. Brown convinced Massey that the old man couldn't possibly live very long at 75 and overweight, so the deal went down. They had two choices: to control or to grow. They obviously chose to grow, and they wanted franchisees to build more outlets and sell more chicken and pay more nickels. That period of expansion today gives us effective national presence and dominance in the QSR market. During that period, the first freestanding KFC restaurants were built. Don Greer, South Carolina, was the first red and white pagoda freestanding building at that time. Subsequent owners: Hugh Blind, May of 1971, R.J. Reynolds, June of 1982, Pepsi-Cola beginning October 1986. All of these folks have naturally tried to control the KFC system. They've tried to channel its growth. They've tried to impart their own culture to how our business is conducted. And they all discovered, much to their surprise, that in addition to acquiring assets, they have joined a healthy and functional family. Now, we as franchisees have always made them welcome. After Pepsi acquired us, Dick Mayer continued to serve as president until August 1st, 1989, when John Cranor was named to head KFC. I remember that date because I helped Dick Mayer pack up his office that very fateful August 1st date. After Cranor's exit in August of '94, David Novak led us to Tricon spinoff in '97. Learning to work with constantly and consistently changing franchisor leadership has been a never-ending task amongst the franchisees since the Colonel sold his business. I have served and worked with every president of KFC except Colonel Sanders. I worked for Colonel Sanders when he took his Sunday dinners in our Corbin store. And yes, I've seen him dump the gravy pots on the floor at his own store. In 1964, the National Advertising Cooperative was formed because Massey and Brown recognized the need to advertise KFC to raise sales and therefore raise royalties. At first, the Colonel appeared on a show like What's My Line? And I've Got a Secret. To fund the strategy, the management of the money was given exclusively to those who had contributed it. More about that in a moment. In August of 1966, the committee agreed to establish a rotating arrangement with each member to be elected for 3 years from franchisees and designated areas. Not only did the company own no company outlets, but there was no provision in any of the existing contracts to contribute to advertising funds. By the time KFC operated stores, which was in 1966 with the purchase of 3 stores in Dallas, Texas, the co-op's charter was already written. The die was cast. By June of 1973, the committee included 9 regional representatives, a franchisee member at large, and 3 KFC members. Each restaurant at that time paid 1%, but in the beginning, Massey and Brown made a deal with franchisees. Voluntarily contribute $25 a month per store, and the company will match it. That was the first contribution, and the first budget was $235,000 all in. The committee was chaired by a franchisee and an executive director, and the staff was directed by the chair. So at that point, franchisees controlled in a democratically elected and an accountable committee, which was the main arm of KFC marketing. That's the big key. so we'll leave the story right there until later. In 1965, the Southeastern Franchisee Association became a reality. The Southeastern, by example, indeed gave support to the formation of other regional associations and eventually, as Bobby has said, to the AKFCF in 1975. Historically, the regions provided a place for franchisees to encounter the corporate agenda on franchisee turf. This unique role of regional associations is a definite key to our future. It also provided a great place to play poker and to drink lots of liquor in Atlanta. In October of 1972, the G&K Settlement Agreement, which was a class action lawsuit, began in Fort Myers, Florida, with the Jarmuthi family, who is still in business today. It resulted in a substantial and far-reaching additions to the contractual rights of the KFC family. But as you hear of the formation of the purchasing co-op, the equality of standards, the transferability, know that these had roots in the G&K Settlement Agreement. The G&K provided for a direct forum for franchisees to bring concerns on the corporate turf for discussion. The NFAC, National Franchisee Advisory Council, was born. Watch clearly the word advisory. After its establishment in 1972, franchisees opted to elect their NFAC representatives rather than have them appointed by the corporation. Wonder why? The NFAC was the path through which most business issues between the corporation and the franchisees were recognized and negotiated. It was out of the NFAC that a committee was formed in June of 1975 to negotiate with KFCC leadership. John Cox was the man that would ultimately become your historic 1976 contract. This negotiated contract extended certain franchise rights and provided Hubeline with substantial authority to enforce standards. It also swept in every franchisee store into the national co-op and into local co-ops. People forget that was a huge give up on the franchisee side. Franchisees received unlimited 10-year renewal rights, a royalty cap, a cap on advertising, and an enhanced ability to sell, transfer, and assign your business. We also got the mile-and-a-half exclusivity. After KFC began introducing addenda to the franchise contract, the franchisees again came to the negotiating table, and a memorandum of understanding in 1984 was established. The beginnings of that committee once again came out of the Southeastern Association, and because I was involved as president of the Southeastern Association, I began to chair the committee that ultimately turned that negotiation over to the AKFCF and the NFAC to establish that 1984 Memorandum of Understanding. Franchisees were pivotal to the textbook turnaround achieved by KFC in January '77, when the famous Mike Miles and Dick Mayer team joined the family from Farmington, Connecticut, out of Hubeline's main office. Churches was the darling of Wall Street. Analysts were writing off KFC as a doomed system. Miles and Mayer introduced the Quasivu Famp and brought out a new image for our restaurants. In 1979 and '80, incentive programs were developed to encourage rebuilding and re-imaging. Almost 20 years later, the '97 settlement agreement produced a deadline of June 1st, 2008 for another wave of facility improvements. A major roadblock to growth and development occurred with the imposition of a new contract by Pepsi-Cola which removed our protection, trashed our 76 contract. That was done effective August 1st, 1989, the very day that Mayor left the building. Franchisees instituted a lawsuit which resulted in the 97 settlement agreement and the 1976 5P contract. After Tricon, and now under Yum, KFC has continued to focus on operational excellence. Franchisees helped David Novak, then HR leader Greg Dietrich, focus on the restaurant general manager as the #1 leader in our business. KFC is still #1 as a system because of our unique and strong partnership with our franchisor and the essential set of keys that we as franchisees hold to secure our future.
Thank you, John. Turning a little bit different direction now, one of the pillars of any franchise business is the supply chain that makes it possible to operate the business. The supply chain in the early days was not what we enjoy today. Your franchisor controlled the supply chain and profited from it. And we've asked Bobby Helms to describe the history of how we got out of that into the situation that you enjoy today. Bobby?
A milestone was the formation of the Kentucky Fried Chicken Purchasing Cooperative. Past history. At one point in time, purchase of all goods, buckets, paper, flour, seasoning, had to be done through Kentucky Fried Chicken Corporation. No competition. Pay whatever they wanted you to and order from them. In the early 70s, Colonel Sanders was advising franchisees on what cooking equipment to use. Kentucky Fried Chicken, under the leadership of Barry Rolls at that time, did not like that idea. And they formed an equipment committee on the NFAC to assist them in looking at standards, quality, and durability of cooking equipment so that they wouldn't have a hodgepodge of different methods of cooking out in the field. The representative and chair of that committee, equipment committee, was Johnny Hannon from Jackson, Mississippi. Johnny reported to the Southeast meeting that the committee had worked well, but when they reached the point of trying to talk about price, the KFCC would not talk to them. A prominent franchisee in that region stood up and said, "Hey guys, if they don't talk about price on equipment which we buy one time, we best start looking at everything else we buy." So the NFAC committee was changed from an equipment committee to an equipment and supply committee. That committee changed, and young John R. Neal was elected to the NFAC, and he became chairperson of that committee. And as they explored what could be bought on the open market versus what franchisees were paying, there was a hue and cry throughout the system, and some of the names called our franchisor were not very polite. But it was a big bone of contention between the NFAC and Kentucky Fried Chicken Corporation. A change in leadership at Kentucky Fried Chicken Corporation occurred in December 1976, and Mike Miles was brought from Farmington back to Louisville to be in charge. His first meeting with the NFAC was in San Diego in February of '77, when Mike polled each individual NFAC member about their feelings about was Kentucky Fried Chicken being honest with them? Were they telling the truth about their cost? Were they, in effect, crooks? Each member of that NFAC body replied in the affirmative, with the exception of Bentley Cummings from Kansas, who said, "In my heart, I don't want to feel that way, but yes, it's true." Mike Miles said he'd never make that mistake again. March of 1977, at the annual convention here in Las Vegas, Hugh Blind brought in their heavyweights of Hicks Waldron, Stuart Watson, Hugh Beef, and had private meetings with individual franchisees and different rooms to try to persuade them of their honor, their integrity, and that their pricing was fair and they would make some concessions in the way they priced things. An open NFAC meeting during that convention, when the chair of the Equipment Supply Committee, John Neal, was standing up making his presentation, he was summarily jerked down by Bob Metzendorf, chairman, as Mike Miles said, "We're going to get out of the supply business." The following month, in April 1977, NFAC meeting in Louisville, Mr. Miles reaffirmed that's what he was going to do. And now, guys, what are we going to do about it? The NFAC had the ball thrown in their court. Dick Mayer suggested to Mike Miles that they hire a consultant to find the best form of supply to the KFC system. Booz Allen Hamilton was hired to do a study. They charged $200,000 for it. The agreement by Mr. Miles was if there was an entity formed, that entity would pay the expense. If there was not, the corporation would pay it. Booz Allen Hamilton's study for the NFAC came back with best efficient, John R., you may have to help me here, most efficient would be for the corporation to buy goods and sell them to franchisees at no markup. Second most efficient was franchisees, corporation buy goods, sell them to franchisees at only their cost. Mr. Miles said, "I have been accused of not being honest. We are not going to repeat the trust issue. We're going to throw that trust issue out the window, and we won't play that field." The third way was the formation jointly of a purchasing cooperative to purchase, take title, and sell those goods to independent distributors who would then distribute to franchisees and corporate stores alike, and therefore the formation of the purchasing cooperative. And they had meetings, had to find someone to run it. They advertised for a president. I think a corporate guy named Rick Duffy was under consideration. Tom Henryon had applied for a job. He was an employee of the purchasing department at KFC. They did not find anybody from advertising in newspapers. Mike Miles called Tom Henryon one day and said, "Are you still interested in that job?" And Tom said, "Yes." Of course, Tom knew they had to hire somebody because they were going to have the first annual meeting and they didn't have a president yet. The first annual meeting was held here, the purchasing co-op was held here in Las Vegas in March of 1980, and was the first meeting that they had with the president on board. The purchasing cooperative operated with like fashion and elected members to their board peacefully, most times competitively, because there's competition out there. We didn't have an exclusive until the acquisition by PepsiCo. And I'll take you over to Bob Peck now to go into the PepsiCo regime.
After PepsiCo purchased KFC in 1986, they began very strong effort to move franchisees away from buying from the purchasing co-op. In fact, they came off of the board of directors. They removed their three directors, I believe it was, because of a conflict of interest, because they had PFS, which was their distribution arm for Taco Bell and Pizza Hut, which they also owned at the time. And they have very aggressively tried to get franchisees to come away from KFC and go to PFS, and many did that, which weakened the sales at your co-op. In the early 1990s, we were successful in encouraging some Taco Bell franchisees to let us source for them. There were some franchisees at that time who had become KFC franchisees who had become Taco Bell franchisees also, and they knew what the purchasing co-op had done for them in saving them money. So several of the Taco Bell franchisees agreed to do this. And the first year that they bought from your purchasing cooperative at that time, they saw an annual savings of about $15,000 per store. So they saw that they too were being overcharged by their franchisor through the PFS entity that they had. We tried to get some of the Pizza Hut franchisees to join us also, but because of pressure from their franchisor, from their association, they resisted this and did not become a part of the co-op at that time. In 1996, I came on the co-op board in 1990, just as Bobby was going off, and became chairman at the invitation of Mr. Pete Harmon. You know, when Pete comes to you and asks you to do something, has anybody out here ever said no to Pete? I don't think they have, anybody that knew Pete. I was in the middle of the contract situation at that time, and really I didn't want another title. But you don't say no to Pete. Anyway, I became chairman of the board in 1991. In 1996, we could see that our survival was very difficult. Increasing sales, competition, it was getting very difficult. And I approached Don Parkinson at that time about KFCC coming back to the purchasing co-op instead of buying through PFS, coming back and bringing their members back on the board and sourcing again through the co-op. And let's kind of coming back together. Don said that he didn't feel that was possible. There had developed at this time some bad blood between Tom Henryon and the corporation. Tom, having come from the corporation and knew a lot of the things that went on there, the relationship was not real good. And Don Parkinson told me at the time, he said, Bob, because of the bad blood, I don't see this ever happening as long as Tom is there. Several months later, I approached one of the most difficult things I ever had to do as a franchisee or being on the board of the directors of the co-op or about anything else. I sat down with Tom one day at one of our board meetings, and I asked him, I said, Tom, if the only way that we can bring unification with our system to purchase together, would you be willing to step aside? And Tom was definitely, I could see that he was hurt by that comment that I made to him at the time. Later, he saw differently, but at that time, it kind of took him off guard, and he wondered why I would ask him something like that. And Tom had told me a couple of years later, he said, you know, Bob, I don't know how much longer I want to stay at the co-op. My dad has told me a long time ago, he said, you don't want to stay too long in a place and lose your respect or let something happen that would hurt you later on. So don't overstay, in other words, in a position. And because he had said that, it made it easier for me to go to him at the time to talk to him. But Tom, later on, we talked several weeks later, and Tom told me, he said, if that's what it took to bring the sides together, he said, I would be willing to do that. So in early 1997, we began a process of meeting with the representatives from the other three concepts and KFC to see what we could work out. Well, of course, in October of 1997, just a few months later, is when Pepsi spun off the restaurant systems into what was then called Tricon Global Restaurant Systems. And at that time, then, we began to get more serious about our talks about the unification of the Tricon group. As we reached the final stages of this in early 1998, I resigned from the board for health reasons, and I was not involved in the final stages. But at that time, David Neal was vice chairman, and he took over as chairman of the board and helped structure the concept at that time. Tom later told David, he did not tell me this, but he later told David, he said, you know, David, he said, the unification, bringing all these groups together is much bigger than me. And so he was willing to step aside, and he really, when he left, there was no bitterness on Tom's part. He left in good graces, and we were all glad to see that happen because Tom had been immensely valuable to the co-op in the forming of it and the early stages of growing it. Just a side note, at the time that in 95, KFC sales, well, let me back up just a moment. There was, PFS wanted to get out of the business. As you know, they wanted to sell out just before Pepsi began to spin things off. They knew what they were going to do. They couldn't spin us off until they got the contract resolved, and that'll come later. But once they got that done, they aggressively moved to divest themselves of the restaurant groups. We at the co-op talked about purchasing PFS, and we offered them $200 million for their business. Many of you, and we felt like that was probably overpriced, but it'd probably be worth it to bring everything together. As you know, later, Pepsi sold PFS to Ameriserve for how much? $800 million plus. And you know what happened to Ameriserve. So you can see that the $200 million we offered was probably maybe a little overpriced at the time, but Ameriserve really got soaked with that, and later they're no more. In 1995, KFC's sales was $385 million. Today, KFC sales are about $1.4 billion, and Jim will speak to more of this later. We're doing that with the same amount of employees that we had with $385 million. We would not have survived as a KFC concept in the purchasing division without the unification, I don't believe, without the unification of the system. Jim?
Well, Bobby explained to you about the formation of the co-op, working together with the corporation, and Bob got to talk to you about the middle years. When the corporation departed, we were a standalone franchisee-only cooperative, and my part's to talk about phase 3, when it was like Yogi Berra said, deja vu all over again. We're working back with the corporation, buying together. I started with the purchasing co-op in 1996, and Bob, you're right. Pete asked me to replace him on the board, and I couldn't say no. I also asked him, I said, what do you do on this board? And he said, it's a lot of fun and nothing really changes. He was only half right. You remember Bob saying in 1996 was when the co-op started being turned upside down. We had to relook at how we were going to survive, how we were going to be able to protect franchisee store-delivered costs. The UFPC was the answer to that question. Today, the UFPC is a $5 billion cooperative, purchasing food, packaging, equipment, services for 5 brands, and operates under a definition given by its operating agreement. This operating agreement was developed by a committee of KFC, Taco Bell, and Pizza Hut franchisees, along with Tricon representatives. The National Purchasing Cooperative Board of Directors approved the operating agreement and recommended its passage to its members, you. Upon passage, the National Purchasing Cooperative became the KFC Concept Cooperative, a concept within the umbrella of the UFPC. The UFPC is the hub organization which oversees centralized purchasing, equipment sourcing, equipment sales, distribution, logistics, and shared services. The KFC Concept Co-op, the staff purchases poultry for all the brands and directs the program management initiatives for KFC products, new processes, and promotions. The board of directors for the KFC Concept approves the budgets, sets the fee margins, recommends changes to the operating agreements, and gives advice and direction to the general manager of the KFC Concept and the CEO of the UFPC. The KFC Concept also elects 2 of its directors to represent them on the UFPC board. One critical right written into that operating agreement, which is given only to KFC, Taco Bell, and Pizza Hut franchisees, is the right of veto. This veto right means that if neither of the 2 KFC representatives on the UFPC board thinks a motion or a decision is in the best interests of the KFC Concept board, that motion fails. This right, negotiated with the help of David Neal and Bernie Royster, keeps the KFC Concept from being outvoted or losing our autonomy. While it would be correct to say that we don't have the same total independence that we had at the pre-unification co-op, it would also be correct to say that we have greater advantages with the new unified co-op. Let me list just a few of those advantages that the UFPC KFC Concept co-op provides that couldn't have been accomplished with the old co-op. It eliminates the flow of sheltered income to Yum. This is no small dollar amount. Yum was able to accept money under the table in various forms that totaled multiple $million per year. That is eliminated. The new co-op is involved from the beginning in product development, specification, sourcing, and pricing. As Bobby mentioned earlier, we wanted to be involved in pricing on both equipment and in products. But what's different from the old co-op to the new co-op is that before we only were involved in going out and negotiating pricing with vendors once the specifications had been made. Now we're a part of the development of a new product so that we can give advice in how to develop that process and to be able to monitor it from the beginning. We've also leveraged the volume not only of KFC franchisor like we had in Bobby Helms' time, but now we leverage the franchisors and franchisees of Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, and now A&W and Long John Silver's. We now purchase 7 times the amount of products with the same head count that the KFC franchisee-only co-op had on staff. We've lowered the co-op's risk of failure from distributors and suppliers. Many years we had to take write-offs at the old KFC co-op because of title failures by one of those 2 entities. We've developed a leading-edge supply chain visibility and monitoring system. We've negotiated a reduction in the average distribution fee. We've returned the equity that you, the members, had in the old co-op. And we've provided expanded services beyond the scope of food, packaging, and equipment to our members. Now, Bob, you had just said that the old co-op wouldn't have survived. And I've known Bob for quite a while, and I certainly trust his integrity, and he is almost always right. Let's assume he is right, and the old co-op wouldn't have survived. You'd all be buying from Yum today with no control. But let's take the other hand, and let's say that that rare opportunity, Bob, was wrong, and somehow that old co-op had scraped and hustled to survive. We would have been in a minority role without much leveraging. And I'd really hate to think what we'd be paying for goods today. In either way, we are much better off with the UFPC than we've ever been in our history with the purchasing cooperative.
Thank you, Jim. You're all familiar with the AKFCF Quarterly, which is, as far as I can tell, the finest franchisee association magazine in the industry. In 1985, the AKFCF's regular communication with its member consisted of a 4-paged mimeographed newsletter. And at the time, Darlene Pfeiffer was challenged to bring forward, to evolve that communication into a stronger voice for the association to communicate with its members. We'll ask Darlene to describe that history.
As you have heard today, the franchisee family was brave, we were fearless, and we fought as hard for each other as we would for ourselves. And this was before the lawsuit was even filed. As you've heard too, Pepsi purchased us. Shortly thereafter, Dick Mayer was out, John Craner was in, and we had just been given a new contract. Things were not looking good at all for us. Also, the company, and as you remember, had an old OFR inspection process, and they were becoming very, very aggressive with that. And we started discussing the need for a better form of communication. As Andy said, we had a 4-page newsletter which consisted mainly of just reporting on the regional meetings in the fall and in the spring. After much searching around, and we looked again to the Southeast, the granddaddy of all the associations and everything, and they had published a commemorative book, and I believe it was for your 25th anniversary, Bobby. And we were quite impressed with that book, so we said, well, who published this for you? Because we had never been in the, magazine business before. We didn't know what to do, how to get even started. So they kindly gave us the name of the man, and we went down to North Carolina to visit with him. And on good faith and a handshake, we got involved with Journalistic to help us publish our magazine. And at that time, none of us really knew how many ads we'd sell. In order to have a magazine, we had to sell ads to our vendor, and Webb Howe, nor myself, nor Bill knew, would the vendors really support a magazine? Would they have to pay to put space in a magazine? But forward we went, and Webb agreed to give us $4,000 a year for the magazine. And that seemed like a lot of money to us at the time, because I remember when I was first vice president, our annual budget was like $60,000 a year. We spent $4,000 sending out the newsletter, so we had an $8,000 swing. So that was big money at that time. So we were really impressed with that. And the vendors did come forth to support us. Winston was one of the very first and has never missed an issue. Documenter, Crestcore, Rough Lighting, and our beloved Mel Bricker supported us from the very beginning, which shows also that the vendors, as you all are well aware, being at all the conventions, are a part of our franchisee family too. They're just wonderful. They've supported us. There have been other franchise associations trying to start a magazine, emulate us, but they didn't get the support for the vendors, and it failed. Bill Stubblefield, as immediate past president, was the first editor. Then I became editor and stayed on until 1994, when Janine Bagshaw became editor. Our first issue happened to be this, and initially we always used the Colonel on the cover page. And once again, it didn't have any date, it didn't have any masthead giving credit to people, didn't, except where we had Bob Peck's article. He was the new president of the Association of Kentucky Fried Chicken at that time, and I was the outgoing president. And I'll give you just an example of where we were coming from when we started this magazine, and I think these words, I wrote them, so they're wonderful words. Now, these words hold true today as they did back then. We must pay attention to our business, and we must also voice our concerns to the corporation. We must assume responsibility for defining our own role and destiny as members of the Kentucky Fried Chicken system. Do not fear speaking up when the occasion warrants. Do not depend on others to do it for you. Speak out, stand together, and work for the franchise system. Your future depends on the vision and unity of all franchisees. So we started with that idea in mind, and it became quite a unifying force for us, which later, when we had our lawsuit. One of my favorite articles, and I couldn't find the magazine, but the main article in that magazine was called Franchisee, Slave or Indentured Servant. And on the front cover, I remember it had handcuffs going around in like a square, handcuffs. And so we fought the battle of the contract through the magazine. And it really was a unifying force for the franchisees in that, as you know, our system is far-flung in small cities. A lot of people don't really get to the conventions or even the regional meetings. But every franchisee in the system got this magazine. We were fearless, and we won the battle. And it was a confluence of events that helped us win the battle. So I give all of the folks up here credit for what they've done, and I also give credit to our little magazine that started out as a newsletter and later became the Quarterly. Now our new publisher is Lionhearted, and Janine Bagshaw's editor, Michelle Hunt as her assistant editor, have turned this magazine into like a 96-page magazine, which will generate between $50,000 and $75,000 a year in advertising revenue. So you can see how far we've come, and I thank the vendors and all of you for your support.
Another just incredible milestone in the history of the association occurred 14 years ago during a period of great turmoil and a lot of tension in the system. We were embroiled in the contract litigation, and as an economy measure, the company decided that they were going to go from an annual to a every other year format for the system convention. And in a great display of good client relations, I turned to the steering committee and said, if you don't pick up that odd year convention, you're crazier than they are. You don't generally get away with that with a client, but I think the steering committee sort of understood what the opportunity was. And Bill Allen volunteered or got volunteered with very little warning and very little time to work with to put together the very first AKFCF convention. Bill?
He's right, with very little warning, that's for sure. But for many years, you know, KFC put on a national convention every year. And it's the best of times to see all our friends from across the country and socialize and talk business. And in those days, of course, the Colonel was there, and it was always a treat to see and listen to the Colonel, as well as the corporate presentations, which were far different then than they are today. The corporation always complained about how much money they spent to put on the convention and how unprofitable it was for them. Even though they charged vendors more for booths back then than we even do today. As the AKFCF group and an incoming first vice president or second even that year, you could sense an ill wind blowing, and our radar screens went up and we started paying attention to what they were doing. As like Andy said, they'd been touting maybe every 2 years on convention, and we didn't want to let that happen. So we did our own homework and made our own book and did a lot of prep. The real story, and I've learned that a long time ago, that there's 700 franchisees out there, and all you have to do is raise your hand and say, I need some help. And that's the unequaled strength that this franchisee community has with KFC. And you new folks in the room, there'll be a day when you should raise your hand and say, I want to help. I want to help pay back. I want to take part. And the best place to do that is in your own home regional association. put both feet in, get on the board of directors, go through the chairs, get yourself in line for one of the national committees, or even the AKFCF as the presidency rotates around, as you've heard. It's a wonderful, wonderful experience, and you'll thank yourself the rest of your life for taking part, because the friendships, the camaraderie is so strong. Coming out of that Las Vegas Hilton first convention, I think we were all energized, and we knew what we could accomplish, and we knew what we could do. Before we left town, we went down Nina, France, and I think there were others, but we went down to the construction trailer at the MGM Grand Hotel that was under construction at the time. And we happened to know the convention manager and the seller for convention services. We knew the fellow, and we said we wanted to talk business. And he had to get out his blueprints, and we literally looked through the blueprints to see if there would be enough exhibit space to hold our convention there the following year, if my mind is working right. And we made an agreement to start working on that right then and there. Since then, your AKFCF has not looked back as far as conventions go. Shortly after that next convention at the MGM, Debbie Newton, the AKFCF administrator, as administrative manager, worked at the purchasing cooperative back there. She came on board to manage the exhibitor show, and it's grown to where some years we've had almost 300 exhibit booths on the floor as you see it today. Debbie does a super tremendous job in helping coordinate all the convention activities. They asked me to stay on after my presidency ended, and to this day, the rest of the 14 conventions with this one, I work with Debbie Newton. She's the boss, and I help solicit vendor booths for the convention, work with the vendors on sponsorships, and generally do a whole lot of kerneling with all the franchisee community on attending, with the vendors on attending, and helping to make things happen, along with many others. That's the neat part. The next step we took was in 1994, and this was a big step forward because we'd been doing conventions to this point by ourselves, growing, and it was a big piece of business by that time. Our leadership engaged Capital Travel out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, to be our convention planner and coordinator, and then working with the AKFCF. They've been with us ever since, making the convention a smooth-running machine. Deborah Callahan, who many of you probably know or don't know, this is the only convention that she comes to herself of the many that her company does, because she's grown to be such an integral part of our family. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. This is really an extraordinary event, and all the work that I do with other franchisee associations, I don't know of any group that has an event of the importance and the scale of the one that your association puts on. We're going to go back in history again. About 10 years ago, the KFC franchisee community already had two of the strongest franchisee voices, franchisee organizations in the country, in the form of a franchisee-owned and operated national advertising co-op and a separate national franchisee-elected advisory council that was the formal interface between the franchise community and the company. And today those two have been combined into a single body called the NCAC. And we've asked John Neal again to give us the history of how we got from two separate and largely unrelated franchisee bodies into today's NCAC. John?
The NFAC, as we all know, was born by virtue of the class action lawsuit called G&K that was actually settled in August of 1972. I was elected to the NFAC in 1974 and to the National Ad Co-op in 1981. So the reason I guess I've been selected to tell you this story, as brief as it is because I've seen it from the inside out. The NAC was actually, as I said earlier, begun in 1965. It was incorporated in 1970. And if you dig back, it was using a Delaware corporation that actually had the name of Haddon Salt Fish and Chips, which was a acquisition of John White Brown in 1969. But we did incorporate, it is incorporated in Delaware using that charter, and then we just changed the name. There was a momentous change in 1973. The KFC Advertising Committee has virtually had the same structure since that time, but a piece of history that very, very few people really know was that in 1973, Hugh Blind held 4 seats on the council. Franchisees had 9. Hugh Blind wanted to be removed from the obligation in 1973 of paying $500,000 extra into the co-op. Because you remember I told you that when the co-op was founded, it was done on a voluntary $25 per month store basis, and the corporation will match that contribution. Well, as the years progressed, Hugh Blind, when they began to own company stores, they were paying the contribution rate, plus they had negotiated themselves into a $500,000 per year. Hugh Blind was having a desperate, struggling time with KFC in the early 70s, so they said, you know, we don't want to pay the extra $500,000, let us off the hook. So your franchisee board members said, okay, we'll let you off the hook, but you give up 1 seat. So that established the value of a seat on the NAC, $500,000. Hugh Blind went to 3 seats. The franchisees went from 9 to 10, with the 10th seat being a member-at-large elect. So 10 votes to 3 is about even in as 13 votes to 4 is today. So how did the committee function in those times? Well, up until 1997, the franchisees dominated, as they do today, the voting power of your NAC at that time. We had a Chicken Littles project called Project X in 1986. Another landmark decision was made at that time. After Pepsi bought us in '86, the Chicken Littles was fixing to go forward. Mayor talked the board into talked Pepsi into loaning $13 million to the NAC so that we could launch Chicken Littles in an extra way, which we did, and of course the history of Chicken Littles may be reborn again in the 99-cent snacker. The Chicken Little was the same sandwich, just dumbed down to a little tiny sliver of pressed chicken meat for 39 cents, no pepper mayo. The snacker is all, as you know, all white meat, pepper mayo, and there we go. We did a lot of landmark things in the NAC, but back then it was very easy. We did generic brand building commercials. We'd go in and do 3 or 4 of them at a time. The rest of our day was spent in Palm Springs playing golf. I served with Jim Collins, who was chairman for many years. I mean, that's what you did. You didn't have to work on a great deal because there were no price points or piece counts until 1988. And in 1988, December, after 1 solid year of deliberation, your NAC did its first television promotion with Scrooge, if you remember. you had Scrooge and a bucket of chicken and all of that.
Mr. Scrooge just loves a bargain, like this great new holiday meal deal from Kentucky Fried Chicken.
What a deal.
10 pieces of finger-licking good chicken.
What a deal.
4 buttermilk biscuits.
Then in June the next year, we did do a piece count, price point promotion, followed the December of '89 with Wild Bill McDonald. Wild Bill brought us stuffing, to those of you that remember the stuffing untested price point promotion. Probably 1990, if my memory serves me correct, Wild Bill McDonald, he was one of the marketing vice presidents. There's been probably 25 of them that I've worked with and the boards have worked with over a various period of time, brought us hot wings. Man, what a novel idea. And we put hot wings on the television, raised sales 15 to 18%, and in I think about 11 to 12 days, we ran out of wings and had to pull the cartridge out of the New York stations.
All right, let's see it. Yeah, Dave. Okay, ready? Get into a new thing. Hot wings. Kentucky Fried Chicken. It's the right thing. Come on and do some hot wings. Get into a new thing. Looks great, Dave. When's she gonna let you drive it? Hot wings. Fried chicken.
Spicy, zesty hot wings. New from Kentucky Fried Chicken.
At that time, the AIP was a responsibility of the corporation, but today we work very diligently with the UFPC to make sure that we have adequate supplies for the promotion that's going on. I became chairman, the elected chairman of the NAC in 1990, and inherited probably the most controversial product at the time was the light and crispy chicken. They test marketed it in New York, and as we were beginning to go forward on a national basis with light and crispy, the New York Attorney General sued KFC, or was threatening to bring suit against KFC for the simple reason that the chicken was neither light nor crispy, because when you double breaded it and cooked it, it actually picked up more oil, if you remember, and you know, it was just horrible. So the marketing folks said, gee, let's change the name to Skin Free, which we did. Now remember, we're under the auspices of John Cranor at this time, and all I can think of, Bill, when you talk about the convention is that thank God for John Cranor and Craig. They were nice people, Harvard educated. He went to a barefoot college in Florida. But I have to tell you, of all the presidents that I've served, he was the dumbest. He was the dumbest. He was absolutely the most out of touch human individual when it came to trying to run an org. Franchisees would never follow John Cranor out of a burning building, you know? All right, moving right along. We went through Skin Free Crispy, and that product ended up, are you ready for this? This is history. You'll never read it anywhere unless you dig way, way back down into the records. It was so bad that after we launched it, customers ate it one time, sales went up, then sales went down, and out it went. Mr. Cranor took an $8 million write-off of Skin Free Crispy, and the only way that he was able to recover any of his money was selling it to the Mexican prison system. Okay. POP Central was formed in 1992. Again, I was chairman for 3 years from 90 to 93, and we formed a POP Central, gave that responsibility to KFC to manage, and we took, I believe, $1.5 million and put that into media. Way back then, you got POP free from the NAC. We worked with the NFAC all the time, and we used the NFAC as a filter for new products because that became the NFAC was their job, equipment, new products. And I remember working very carefully with Charlie Middleton. We had private meetings. Charlie says, what is it you need to know before you launch Skin Free, et cetera, and we developed a 16-item list hurdle that if the NFAC said it was okay, then we'd bring it to the NAC and we would determine whether or not it would go on the national calendar. The NFAC, of course, worked through the OEC on the OFR. Now, I know that's a lot of acronyms, but there it is. It says here in '97 what happened to the NFAC and the NAC. Well, let's go to the settlement agreement itself, and this was part of my speech yesterday. I covered the reenactment where David Novak attempted to unofficially alter our organizational guidelines. Now, last year, this is what Mr. Novak wanted to do in the reenactment, for which I called upon none other than Keith Chambers and Darlene Pfeiffer to be prepared to fight a reenactment battle. What Mr. Novak wanted was to close all subcommittee meetings to all franchisees. He wanted to limit subcommittee members to 3, and they must be NCAC elected members. As vice chair, I have the power of appointment to subcommittee members, and we negotiated that in the '97 settlement so that your NCAC board could reach out to franchisee leaders anywhere in the United States and those willing and desirous of serving on a subcommittee. They wanted to close off that right. They wanted all subcommittee meetings to be held in Louisville or a test market. And that contravenes the bylaws because we are able to have subcommittee meetings anywhere the subcommittee chairman chooses to have that subcommittee meeting. Gag order, do not talk to the media. That was particularly addressed to those franchisees that know reporters and are frequently interviewed in the press. There is no gag order in our '76 contract or in the bylaws. Number 5 was really a shocker to the board. They asked for Peggy Lindrup and Alan Forsythe's head. They wanted them removed. And probably even more exciting to me is that Mr. Novak's consigliere, who is Chris Campbell, the General Counsel of Yum, asked me in open forum for my resignation. Not only did he ask me for my resignation, but at a cocktail party, he said, John R., this is best for the system. You have created such a disruption in the KFC brand. It's just best for do it for your fellow franchisees. Do it for the system. Mr. Novak will create a very appropriate reward. You will, in other words, in my mind, I'm going to have a state funeral. And I asked him as I looked him straight in the eye, I said, do you plan to put my bust out in the square next to the Colonel? And he looked back because he's a very serious lawyer. And, you know, he was being dead serious. And I told him, you know, not in my lifetime will I resign. And you tell Mr. Novak I appreciate that offer. The rest of it was no ops subcommittee. Mr. Novak challenged me in person by saying that I had single-handedly recreated the NFAC through the ops subcommittee. We've had an ops subcommittee since 1997. It just wasn't called the ops subcommittee. It was called the Facility Operations and Equipment Subcommittee. Number 7, Mr. Novak wanted no voting on any subcommittee. And my question is, how in the hell do you get consensus if you don't have a show of hands or whatever? We agonized over this from May until September. And in September, after numerous meetings in the Chicago and San Diego and Louisville and executive committee meetings and blah, 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 your NCAC signed a letter. All 13 members signed that letter, and we handed it to, I handed it to Mr. Dietrich in an NCAC meeting last September, and the letter was one page, and it said, no mas, no more. We're not going to discuss or deliberate this anymore. Sorry, let's move on. And Mr. Dietrich took that letter, and he looked up at me, and he said, next. And we went on with our meeting. I don't know if you have on the monitor the 97 settlement, because yesterday in my speech, you want to know what the NFAC and the NAC got. KFC secured rights such as hiring and firing the national agency, singular. Hire and fire the PR agency, singular. Not multiple agencies, one each. They get to direct them. They get to manage them in terms of directing the creative and directing the PR. The other thing they wanted is to merge the two groups together, which I just said that they did. And I also said, don't forget that your fellow franchisees paid $23 million to extend their contracts. Now, what did we get in '97? We got the 76 5P contracts, the 5 Ps in your existing store contract forever. That is the longest living, unchanged franchise contract that we know of in the history of the world. And it is a very sensitive, soft spot for KFC because, number one, it caps the royalty at 4%, caps the advertising at 5%. You get 10-year successive renewals, and in paragraph 4, you get 1.5 miles exclusive territory, and number 5, you get the right to sell your business or assign it to your children. You got a 20-year sign-up option if you chose, and 98% of you did that. Your NCAC maintains budgetary controls over domestic spending, all dollars, the $130 million, not $1 can go out of that fund without the NCAC approval. And the OEC continues to be a permanent subcommittee of the NCAC. And yes, Mr. Steve Provo, the OEC travels on the same travel expense policy as does the NCAC. The OEC does not travel on Yum's travel policy, as you know, Mr. Bauer. That enough, Andy? Yeah. Okay.
I don't know of any other franchise organization in the country that's got protection for your investment like what the things John's describing. Another major element of this, and it's a subcommittee, it's a standing subcommittee of the NCAC, is the OEC, yet another acronym. Fred Bauer, past president of the AKFCF, is going to describe the OEC.
You know, yesterday we heard from both speakers that men and women don't think alike. And I think it's also very important to remember that corporate people and franchisees don't think alike. And we don't approach problems and we don't approach situations from the same viewpoint. And we have to work hard to come out at a common solution and a solution that's best for the system. And so I think that's something that happens on the backdrop of everything that all of these presenters have said. There's been different viewpoints to a problem that's occurring, most times not created by the franchisees, but anyway, to come to a common solution. I think the other thing to remember is that there's one constant in our system, and that is the franchisees. We're the really only constant. And so I'm going to talk about the OEC a little bit, and going back to way back, as we heard yesterday from Jim McKelvey, into the 70s, and then in the 80s it was the QSC committee. Dr. John Mann was involved in this and created the Mystery Shop program. And the committee was involved in setting the standards, the forms, the questions, and many franchisees have served on that committee. And we hear about the end results, the Champs Check program, but I think we have to remember that committee has been a lightning rod at different times on a lot of things. Champs mystery shops weren't always as welcome as they were in our system as they are now back then, because there was a lot of controversy over this. Is this going to be a mandatory program? Are we going to have to do this? Who's going to keep the records? What are they going to use these records for? We tend to forget that because we've worked through some of those things, but they were very difficult times for the system, and we've moved on to that. But you know, then programs like the 100 Club and the Promise Pride, and how do people get to be involved in that? And again, viewing it from different viewpoints, the corporate viewpoint and the franchise viewpoint, because we view it differently. A lot of struggles went on then. And then the OFR. I don't know if many of you realize that even now, your stores are shopped once a quarter free by the corporation with the mystery shop, because that was the key to triggering an OFR. And that has since gone away now that we have the CER. And so that committee has been involved in a lot of different programs, standards, measurement, training, and recognition. The members of the committee, if you remember correctly, in most of your regional associations, it was hard to get a member to join up for that committee, at least in our Great Lakes it was, because they got beat up the most when they came back to talk about what was going on in the mystery shop program, and those folks always had a tough time. And remember that all of this, a lot of this occurs with the backdrop of the lawsuit, which, you know, permeated a lot of the situation, which made it a tough time for everybody. And yet that committee still worked together to come out with the best decision possible to answer our customer needs and to work towards a common solution. Then in the mid-90s, sometime in the 90s, if you remember, we had this struggle to get onto the mystery shop program, and then the corporation wanted to drop it. They wanted to get off the mystery shop program because they wanted to save money. And the franchisees encouraged them not to do that, but they did it anyway. And about a year later, they were back on the mystery shop program because they saw their store's standards slip and fall. Several times over the years, I believe 92 and 96, they wanted to do away with the committee. There was a push to do away with the committee, and that's why in the 1997 settlement, the people that negotiated that settlement and the joining of the two committees wrote the OEC into the settlement agreement, into the bylaws, that it would be a permanent committee, because the franchise members at that time saw the value of this committee and the need for this committee and the power that this committee would have in future years. And it has seemed to work out that way. The visionaries that worked on these things. And so that is, I believe, John, the only committee that's written in perpetuity into the bylaws of the NCAC. And in 1998, the committee was a smaller committee. In 1998, one of the part of the settlement was that the committee would be the same size as the NCAC, would be elected by regions. And in 1998, the committee was expanded to that size. The committee now oversees such things as measurement, the new Champs Check program, training, and recognition. And so time goes on, a lot of things come back around, and that committee will be there to work with all of these things. And I would say that some of the battles that other members fought, we are still fighting. KFC right now has withdrawn almost all support for training. I think there's maybe one person in the training department. They have their system, but they don't have anything for us. And so right now there's three things that the OEC is working on, that we're going to keep a continual involvement in the customer-based Champs Check, but we are really, really strongly encouraging them to spend money on training, because how can we be a world-class organization if we don't provide the training to the franchisees and to their employees? And the other thing that has been going on is they have been trying to recast our role as part of the CAB board, which is an organization in Yum that is represented by the CHAMPS members, 2 members from each of the concepts that is the CAB, the CHAMPS Advisory Board, which they would like to see to develop programs and the OEC to implement programs. And the committee members don't want that to happen, will not let that happen, because that's not how we see our role. We see our role as developing programs for the KFC system. We don't want to be yummified so that it's one for all in some areas that we want to keep control of. And so I think that's it for me, Andy.
Thank you, Fred. Yet another committee that performs just a critical function for the KFC system. This is, like so many others, is important because it involves large quantities of money, is the Beverage Committee. And another AKFCF past president, Kevin Schlutz, will describe the functions of the Beverage Committee.
In 1995, just 10 years ago, the KFC system purchased about 4 million gallons of syrup a year. There was no contract with any of the franchisees, and rebates when they got them were about 25 cents a gallon. Sensing an opportunity and with the urging of the franchisees, the co-op hired a consultant and started negotiating for a contract to benefit all the franchisees. They hired Jeff Schenk, a former Pepsi person, and his consultancy was in beverages. And since then, there's been 3 different contracts, both with Pepsi and with Dr. Pepper. The first one was just for 2 years, just trying to get their feet wet. And it was interesting because the Pepsi wanted to make it a longer contract. And the negotiating group said, no, what if Pepsi spins off the restaurants? We don't want to be locked into this contract. So they made it a 2-year contract. And sure enough, within 2 years, Tricon was formed, the restaurants were spun off, and we were free to negotiate another new contract. And naturally, with the restaurants spun off, it was even more important to have us as customers. The next contract was for 5 years, and it was interesting because it turned out to be a better contract than what KFC Corporation had for their own stores. So they were real eager to go ahead and do a new contract again, and they brought together all the brands and formed another committee, negotiated again with Pepsi, and came out with what at that time was the biggest contract with any Pepsi customer and made us their very most important customer. Part of that contract was that there had to be a beverage subcommittee, and so that's locked in as well as long as we have that contract. Our beverage rebates have just gone up untold amounts, and since 1995 until last year, we had huge increases in sales of beverages every year. Until this last year, we're now at 10 million gallon a year beverage volume. Included in the rebates, the AKFCF also received 5 cents a gallon to use for conventions and regional meetings, and they work with the beverage subcommittee to ensure that all the funds and volume is captured. This beverages is such a big thing. This year we'll bring in $550 million in beverages, and that's about 100,000 per store. And going forward, we have a very strong beverage subcommittee. We have a good beverage consultant. And we have 2 beverage partners that are very aggressive in trying to bring ways for us to build our beverage sales and profitability. And I think the important thing is that this all goes back to the purchasing co-op and franchisees who weren't happy and saw an opportunity and started working toward building our beverage business. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. You heard Bobby Helms at the beginning of this session say that from the very beginning, the Association of Kentucky Fried Chicken Franchisees was conceived as being much more than just domestic U.S. franchisees. Almost from the beginning, it's included international franchisees, Caribla representing the Caribbean and Latin American markets for KFC, and the franchisees there has been a member of this association for more than 20 years. In the intervening years, we've grown. At one point, we had active membership all the way around the world. That group has formed its own international coalition. We've asked another past president of the association, John Marcella, to describe the growth of the association into international markets, and also to describe our relationship internal to the United States and internal to the Yum system with our sister organizations in the Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, Long John's, and A&W systems.
When you look at the history of the international group, I mean, you would have to go back to almost 1965 when Great Britain formed their association. They have a long history themselves in terms of their own formation of their association, working together as franchisees to deal with the common interests and concerns they had with their corporate partner at that time, going back those years. And over a sequence of many years, if you look at all our international associations, the Caribla, that's been in existence for over 20 years, and you have Canada, and you have Mexico, and Australia and South Africa and even the Middle East have formed associations. And the long history of our association has always been an open door policy. Each one of these here, past presidents and some that aren't on this panel, all in some capacity encouraged our international group to be part of our domestic associations and under the umbrella of the AKFCF. And I could tell you on behalf of those members how much they appreciated that open door policy that we had. It was a very unique thing. John Arneal said it, you know, one of the strengths that has always existed in our franchise community was the formation of our associations. And our international group learned from a lot of things that we did here in the United States and the long history that we have and how we pull together as one, working as a unison with a common voice to deal with the numerous amount of issues that took place over the last 25 years. And through that alliance with us, and through that association with us, that they too were faced with unique challenges. And on the landscape of the international group, they have some really unique challenges that we don't face here in domestic regions. Obviously, they have cultural differences. They have language differences. And also the way they're managed by Yum, they have actually a different head corporate individuals who oversee that particular region. So it's very difficult from a commonality in working in those things. The other thing, they even have different contracts. Some are much more stringent than others, but once again, as John Arneal said, through this association, we have, bar none, the best contract that exists in the entire world. And the actual notion of the international group forming an independent association was part of I think it was one of a milestone from a historical standpoint under the leadership of AKFCF past presidents Joe Olnick and Lois Faust in Dallas of 2002, where a lot of members on this panel and out there in the room participated in that. And it was a milestone from the standpoint that we as an association took a very hard look, critical look at ourselves to ensure that the founding principles, the things that we formed our association, they still make sense now? Do we need to somehow change in some directions? I'll never forget, I was sitting during one of those lunch breaks with a longtime board member on the AKFCF from Great Britain was Michael Whitaker, that's no longer associated with the KFC system, sold the store several years back, and Gideon Milan. And we were sitting and having lunch, and Michael Whitaker said, you know, if we can only form an association, an international association that has the unity, that has the passion, that has the franchisees, that can have one common voice, if we can only do that on the international level. And that was the first time that I've actually heard, me personally, of some idea of forming an international group. And with that background, and with the advent of rapid expansion through 1997-98, and you saw it evidence yesterday with the documentary video we saw on the celebration of the 1,000th China store. Yum, all their capital is being invested overseas in development. And I don't think it's a far-fetched notion on my part that within 5 to 7, maybe 8 years, there will be more international KFC restaurants than we have currently here in the domestic USA. China alone can outpace all the stores we have in the United States. So our board members, our IKFC board members, going back to when Bob Fulver was our AKFCF president, we formed a subcommittee composed of our international board members, and we had a liaison, and Andy Selden served on that subcommittee that ultimately became the steering committee to form an international group. And through that subcommittee, with representation from our international regional members at that time, we start talking, how can we formulate an international association? And quite frankly, it was necessary to deal with the contractual issues, with the advent of multi-branding, and with the different contractual nuances they had as it related to their ability to develop. It became pretty apparent to them that their common interests would be best served if they could form their own international association. So subsequent with that, under the leadership of the steering committee chairman at that point, which was Gideon Milan of South Africa, and working very closely with Andy Selden, they were able to formulate and start working on how can we form this association. And that was all culminated in 2004 in New Orleans, when the international group ratified their association and bylaws. We, as an association, the AKFCF, still have an open door policy. We invited all the international group. They could still remain board members of our association if they so choose, and most of them did, and are here during our current convention. In fact, the Caribla in 2004 piggybacked off our AKCF convention and had their own mini regional meeting tied in with our association. The history of the International Association is not written yet. They themselves are going through a challenging time. The formation of any entity is always challenging in its inception years. So if we have any international members out there, I would urge you to stay united, stay focused, work together for a common goal, and make our mission statement that we formulated back in, that we had and we revised actually in 2002 in Dallas. The mission of the Association of Kentucky Fried Chicken Franchisees is to unite KFC franchisees worldwide and to protect and advance their interest. And we as an association should be proud of the fact that we lived up to that mission statement and the way we nurtured and supported our international group to form their own association. So I would like to give a hand of applause for everyone in this room, our board members on this panel, for truly, truly their leadership in helping our international partners to form their own association. Now, with the advent of multi-branding and Yum, it also became pretty apparent to our sister associations of Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, Long John Silver's, and A&W, that some alliance needed so that we can sort of calibrate the motives of Yum as it related to multi-branding. That all started several years back under the AKFCF leadership of Joel Nolick and Lois Faust as well. And I think, Fred Bauer, you might have just been peeling off at that time as AKFC president. When Taco Bell started co-branding with the Pizza Hut Expresses. And I don't know if there was any Pizza Hut franchisees in this room that are also KFC franchisees, but that seemed very worrisome, quite frankly, to our Pizza Hut franchisees, that cannibalization, the impact, all these things were starting to surface with that. So an informal get-together to meet with David Novak to talk about that specifically, we formed an informal meeting with David Novak with representatives from Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, and KFC. And our participation in that meeting was more of an observer, seeing and what was going on and trying to get a feel for the new landscape that we're now operating with from a Yum standpoint. And to credit with Jimmy Olsen and his group on the Unified Purchasing Co-op, some of our obstacles and barriers that was present prior to the formation of UFPC, that we as associations could start working together with a single common voice, thought, well, maybe that's not a bad idea if we can carry that over not only from our purchasing procurement opportunities, but our basic relationships that we have with Yum. About 2 years ago, Bud Jenkins, who was chairperson of FranMac, called Bob Forward, who was our AKFC president at that time, and said, you know, we might want to get together again and see if we have any common interest. So we met in Chicago. At that meeting, we had representatives from KFC, and if my memory serves me well, I think, John R., you were part of that meeting. I was part of that meeting, Bob Forward, and we sat down and discussed with our co-partners at that time, which was Taco Bell and Pizza Hut, some of the challenges they faced. And I believe, Andy, you were at that meeting as well. And from that meeting, it made good sense for us to form some type of alliance that we could work together in unison, particularly with the advent of multi-branding as it related to the multi-brand contract. We, at that point, we said, we didn't want to overshadow or somehow supersede our association's leadership. The agreement was made with that group that would be strictly an advisory capacity where we would discuss mutual interest, strategy and tactics as it related to how we wanted to relate to Yum, as it related to the multi-brand and consequence impact guidelines associated with multi-branding. We formulated operating guidelines that we currently operate under. As I said before, it's strictly advisory, that we work very closely with the executive board of the AKFCF, with and a current member on the AKFCF president serves in that capacity as part of that representation we have on the KFC. We rotate the leadership of the council from KFC, Taco Bell, and Pizza Hut. About a year ago, our sister partners from A&W and Long John Silver's became part of the Five Concept Council. We meet on a regular basis. We have conference calls to discuss those things of mutual interest. And obviously, the number one thing we're still working really hard on is the impact that multi-branding has. It's still an outstanding issue. I feel very confident that our sub-chairperson of the Five Concept Council, led by Keith Chambers, is heading that group up. And it's been a long and I think it's going to be a continuous issue on impact guidelines, on how it impacts us from a multi-brand standpoint. That's a very complex and something that we cannot take lightly. Each of our futures depends, our financial future depends on the ability of us to operate without having external financial hardship placed on us because of doing a multi-brand concept too close to our existing concept that we have. With that, Andy, I'd just like to editorialize just one little bit. 1 minute. Over 20 years ago, I was like a lot of you out there. I'm hoping I'm talking to the second and third generation. That how do you get involved? And I was at a fishing trip with Bobby Helms, and I was kind of frustrated because the old good old boy network. How do you get involved with this? Is it even worth getting involved? And Bobby took me aside and said, "John, you need to get involved. Not only your personal future as it relates to your own business, but the relationship that we have with one another. And over 20 years, I've come to learn and respect that advice. So if there's any advice I can give you out there, is get involved in your regions. Ask for leadership roles that you could play. Evolve, because all our future leaders for the AKFCF come from the regions. And I would urge our regional presidents and all our associations and our regional associations to keep cultivating leadership. Because as you can see from the 35 years history we have here and the future 35 years, who knows what obstacles and challenges we're going to face. It's only through strong leadership have we been able to survive those challenges. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Andy.
Thank you, John. You've heard the history. Especially the younger people here today might say, okay, so what? What do struggles that occurred 20, 30, 35 years ago have to do with me? I would suggest to you that the history that you've heard have a lot to do with you. It certainly is the foundation for your net worth and your future prospects as a KFC franchisee. I would say that it's very likely that without the history that you've heard described here this morning, you wouldn't be here as a second or third generation owner in this system. Other brands don't have successive renewal rights that are a feature of the KFC contract. You've heard several of the speakers refer to the 76-5P franchise agreement. Think about some of the foundation stones that are in that contract. Think about what this means for your prospects and the value of your business as a KFC franchisee. Think about having a fairly long initial term, a 20-year term. Think about having free transferability so that you can always realize the equity in a KFC restaurant. Think about the successive renewal rights so that you can hand these assets on to your successors. Think about your growth rights represented in Section 19 of your franchise agreement. Think about the fact, John R. and a couple of the others mentioned that several of the critical elements of this contract are locked in. They can never be taken away in future renewal franchise agreements, no matter what else might change. These are the provisions of this contract that this history has led us to that protect your equity in this business, and they protect the prospect of profitability in the KFC brand. In terms of operations and in terms of the month-to-month, year-to-year profitability of your businesses, your 76-5P franchise agreement gives you the exclusive territory for, in most cases, a 1.5 mile radius around your restaurant. It gives you QSR exclusivity on the KFC brands and products. You will never see a KFC kiosk inside another fast service restaurant. It gives you a relatively low fee structure. The 4% royalty is no longer the norm in the fast food business. Yum thinks that the KFC franchise is easily worth 6%. How'd you like to have your royalty bill go up 50%? Your KFC 76-5P franchise agreement gives you effective control over a $130 million a year national advertising program. Most other franchisees turn in their advertising contributions to their franchisor, and the franchisor decides when, where, and how that money is spent. You've heard a description of the NCAC. I don't know of any other franchise system that has a body that has the role and the influence in system policy making that the NCAC has. John R. mentioned the Equal Protection Clause. I don't know of any other franchise agreement in the country that holds the franchisor to the same standards for its stores that it imposes on franchisees. And it guarantees you, it doesn't give you, it guarantees you your free competitive sourcing opportunities exercised through the KFC National Purchasing Co-op. I could go on and on. That's just scratching the surface. Those are the biggies. I want to turn back for just a moment to Bob Peck, who led the association through the titanic struggle with PepsiCo that got you those contract rights, to offer a comment for the group on how we got that contract.
Well, I just want to tell you about a situation that happened in August of '89. As John alluded to earlier, on August the 1st, John Craner came to Louisville with his high-powered attorney from New York and said, we thought we were going to negotiate. He said, here's your new franchise agreement. We couldn't get him to change his mind. John R. went out with Wallace Fowler, I believe it was, and talked to him. Couldn't get him to change his mind. I was instructed by our executive committee, as I was president of the association at that time, to call a meeting of the franchisees in Louisville later in August at the Galt House. We called that meeting. We came there. John Craner was there. He talked down to us. He said, I know some of you out there would like to sue KFC. That would be the worst thing you could ever do. For the first time, a CEO got booed from the franchisees. Later in that meeting that day, we asked the franchisees what they wanted to do about this. A motion was made that we start a litigation fund, a war chest as we called it. And at that meeting, we raised $3 million in about 10 minutes to form our war chest. As we were taking the vote, we had a terrible thunderstorm in the area. Lightning was real fierce, the rain was heavy. Many of you were there, some of you were there. I'm not sure how many, but those who didn't need to hear this. The thunder was so loud that sometimes as I was speaking, it would drown you out. You couldn't even hear. Just as we took the vote, I asked for the vote on it. The vote was unanimous. Just as we took the vote to do this, there was the loudest clap of thunder that I believe I've ever heard in my life, and just drowned us out. And my presence of mind could only say this: I believe the Colonel just gave us his endorsement on what we've just done. And that was a historic time for us.
The bottom line, in my estimation, is that the history, the struggles, the sacrifice, the effort that you've heard described this morning have created in the Kentucky Fried Chicken system a relationship that is unique in the industry. What you have in practice is a partnership with your franchisor, unlike the relationship that so many other franchisees have, which is more characteristic of being like a North Korean relationship. You don't have that because of the effort that you've heard described here today. I want to tell you that an association is a priceless asset. An association that has the strength and the unity and the solidarity that this one has is beyond description. The association leverages the strength of numbers. One-on-one, any of you, even a large operator like JRN or Harmon, going one-on-one with Yum is going to lose. But when you put it together in an association, when you put together the structure that you've heard described this morning, franchisees can almost write their own ticket in the franchise relationship. The strength of the AKFCF lies in its regions. It lies in its volunteerism, such as you've heard described this morning, and it resides in the solidarity and the unification that this group has always had. We have our arguments internally, but when the vote is taken and the thunder cracks, that's the end of the debate, and this group sticks together. The AKFCF, in my experience, is the strongest and the most effective franchisee association in the world, and it's up to you as the members of the next generation to keep it that way. So with that, I think we're going to wrap this up. We thank you all for coming this morning.